This presentation is about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. We're going to review the key clinical understandings of this particular disorder, something that is actually a natural response to life events. At the end, we're also going to start exploring exactly what is this thing we call stress. And finally, the sheep in this photograph is likely pregnant, maybe close to giving birth, which I can only assume is a stressful event, but in a very good way. The following information on the following 10 slides is from the National Institute of Mental Health. I think it's a great and concise description of PTSD, and that's why I've included it in this lecture. You want to basically understand what PTSD is cold as a clinician. You want to know what you're looking at, what you're looking for. And again, I think these slides, this description, and what I've pulled from their description to give to you here is a really good, excellent, actually, description of what PTSD is all about. So I'm going to read them mostly word for word, just so you know from each slide. And again, there are 10 of these slides. So an overview. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is something that develops in some people who have experienced a shocking, scary, or dangerous event. It's all about being terrified. That's what PTSD, it's all about being terrified. It is natural to feel afraid during and after a traumatic or terrifying event or situation. Um, Fear triggers, we talked about in primary emotions, the fear response. Fear triggers many split-second changes in the body to help defend against danger or to avoid it. It is the typical fight or flight response, fear response, fight or flight response, and is a typical reaction meant to protect a person from harm. And all mammals actually with the same brain system and how it interacts with the body. It's a typical reaction to protect a person from harm. Nearly everyone will experience a range of reactions after trauma, yet most people recover from initial symptoms naturally. Most people recover in that way. Those who continue to experience problems or difficulties may be diagnosed with PTSD. People who have PTSD may feel stressed or frightened even when they're not in danger. And that's really kind of the thing. When you're not in danger, so you're having a flashback, you just had a nightmare, stuff like that. And that's exactly what PTSD includes. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So signs and symptoms of PTSD. While most but not all traumatized people experience short-term symptoms, the majority do not develop ongoing or chronic PTSD or the symptoms thereof, as I mentioned in the last slide. Not everyone with PTSD has been through a dangerous event. Some experiences, like the sudden, unexpected death of a loved one, can cause PTSD. But the point is, you're having a huge emotional response, which, by the way, opposite of PTSD, but when you're suddenly so happy, something happened that makes you so happy, you have a huge emotional response. And every time you think of it, you may feel this incredible happiness. So this isn't just about fear and being terrified. It's just like, it's just every huge, huge emotional response we typically remember. We can get, cues that make us, think about it again, then therefore we feel about it again. So, but a sudden unexpected death of a loved one is in a way a traumatic event. Also, I just want to add. Symptoms usually begin early, within 3 months of the traumatic event, but sometimes they begin years afterwards. Pretty atypical in my experience as a therapist, but it can happen. The symptoms must last more than a month to be diagnosed as PTSD, and severe enough to interfere with a person's relationships or work or school to be considered PTSD. Signs and symptoms continue. The course of the illness varies from person to person. Some people recover within 6 months, while others have symptoms that last much longer, if not a lifetime, especially if not treated with psychotherapy and change. In some people, the condition becomes chronic, like I just said, depending on life situations. And also, to be diagnosed with PTSD, an adult must have these following symptoms for at least a month. You want to know these as well. So, at least one re-experiencing symptom. So a re-experiencing symptom of fear, which may include like a flush of heart rate and like a body temperature and stuff like this, like flush of the fear response. At least one avoidance symptom, which means you're avoiding a place or a person or a thing or something that reminds you of it, and so you're avoiding it. At least two arousal and reactivity symptoms. We'll talk about those next. And at least two cognition and mood symptoms. Again, we'll talk about next. So, getting into the re-experiencing symptoms, flashbacks, just reliving the trauma over and over, just including, of course, the physical symptoms. That's the important thing is like in a terrifying event, we have these huge physical symptoms because emotions are this combination of brain chemistry to body tissue and back and forth. So flashbacks, and then you have those same feelings again. Bad dreams or nightmares. Obviously, people will have nightmares that relate exactly to the trauma, although dreams are kind of weird representations of life, but nightmares and bad dreams. And again, waking up after having that and remembering it, your body's in full fight or flight as well. Frightening thoughts. Anytime you just start thinking about the event or thinking about something that could cause it to happen again, you're going to have the same emotional response. So re-experiencing symptoms may cause problems in a person's everyday routine. The symptoms can start with the person's own thoughts and feelings. Words, objects, or situations that are reminders of the event can also trigger re-experiencing symptoms. Moving on to avoidance symptoms. It's staying away from people, places, events, objects that are reminders of the traumatic experience. Like if you got attacked, like beat up in the parking lot of a grocery store, you're obviously going to remember that and stay away from that parking lot until you decide if you want to through exposure therapy, get back into it. But you could also be afraid of every parking lot after that also, very, very obviously. Another avoidance symptoms, which is avoiding thoughts or feelings related. So you start to feel a big panic or a big survival fear response biologically in your brain and body, and then you just like want to avoid that at all costs. You want to do something else, not think about it, just not feel actually that. Things that remind a person of the traumatic event can trigger avoidance symptoms. These symptoms may cause a person to change their personal routine. For example, after a bad car accident, a person usually drives, may just avoid driving or riding in a car. So classic, again, it's the idea like if we're like in an extremely fearful situation, our brain and our body and our feelings wants to avoid that again, because if it was life-threatening again for the first time, it could be life-threatening again. The problem is that for modern life and just life in general, if those thoughts and feelings and flashbacks and nightmares interfere with life, we want to be able to change that. We psychotherapists will help people change that. But it's a natural, normal response to a life event. That's the big thing to know here. Arousal and reactivity symptoms. Being easily startled. Suddenly, like anything that relates to any sort of like fear response, but certainly something that relates to the trauma, the terrifying event, will be easily started. Feeling tense or on edge, and that could be only when in and around a similar situation that was terrifying. It could be for a long time just terrified in general, because like something almost killed you yesterday, so you're just really tense and on guard and very afraid for some days afterwards, if not longer. Of difficulty sleeping, the idea being like, if like in the past, a wild animal was wanting to eat us, we're not supposed to be falling asleep if they're hanging around because, well, we could be caught, right? So it's difficult to fall asleep when you've had a trauma. I mean, because your arousal system is just right up there, again, for protection and staying alive. Having angry outbursts, that relates to the fight response. We talk about flight or fight. So the fight response is to fight back the intruder, the invader, the thing, whatever's trying to hurt you. And so we need an emotion to fight back. And that's what anger is all about, is fighting back. And so we may have angry outbursts, our clients may have angry outbursts after a traumatic event. So to summarize, arousal symptoms are usually constant instead of being triggered by things that remind one of the traumatic events. The symptoms can make the person feel stressed, which is afraid and angry, and they make it hard to do daily life, like sleeping, eating, concentrating, working, going to school, studying, anything like that. Next, moving on to cognition and mood symptoms. This is trouble remembering key features of the traumatic event. Your mind may have just blocked it out, again, for protective reasons. It just don't remember, or at least at this time remember. And then it can cause negative thoughts about oneself and the world. Like you may think like somehow you're at fault, and you think like, well, maybe even I deserved it. That can happen. And then the world can be like, of course, an unsafe place. So you have negative, or actually, I think are normal thoughts about the world. You want to change them to know that the world can be and is a safe place for the most part in most places. But you may have those perceptions of the world after that. Again, going to what I talked about, negative thoughts about self, this distorted feelings like guilt or blame, like, oh, I got beat up because I was in the wrong parking lot, or I was there too late at night. No, it isn't your fault. We want to tell people the person who beat you up, it's their fault. They're the ones who did it. And then, of course, loss of interest in enjoyable activities. When our brains, our minds, our bodies are so overwhelmed by the fear response, it's like it's hard to enjoy anything else. So that's what that is. In summary, cognition and mood symptoms can begin or worsen after the traumatic event, but are not due to injury or substance use. The symptoms can make the person feel alienated or detached from family and friends. So all going together with a survival fear response. Another slide on cognition and mood symptoms. It's natural to have some of the symptoms for a few weeks after a dangerous event, but when the symptoms last more than a month, seriously affecting one's ability to function, and they're not due to substance use or medical illness, except for the event itself. That's when it might be, and that's when we may diagnose PTSD. Some people don't show any signs of PTSD for a long time. There's a lot of masking and hiding that would be going on. And it may be conscious or subconscious, but that's what would be going on. And PTSD is often accompanied by depression, substance use, or one or more of the other anxiety disorders. So we're going to talk about that more, especially the next lectures on toxic stress, and they are two different things. We'll talk about that in a second. But there's more to explore in terms of how PTSD can cause depression. And usually there's other stuff going on, or it's over time after that traumatic event, and then you pull yourself out of life because you're so afraid of everything. Then you may have a lot of sadness or depression around just not being involved in life anymore. So we'll talk about that more in this class as it goes on. So that concludes the slides from the National Institute of Mental Health, which I think again are just great summary of understanding what PTSD is all about and what you're looking for as a clinician. You use the DSM, but you use this an awful lot, and anything else, of course, you find to understand what it is. Now we move into, at the end of this lecture, what is stress? This is really important for this class. It's really important for you as a clinician. It's really important to describe to your clients what is stress. So what's really amazing about PTSD is the name, and it really gets us going as to understanding what is stress. So let's break it down. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Post means after, and traumatic means terrifying event, just terrifying event, not life, event. After the terrifying event, there's a stress disorder, which is a fear response. It's a huge survival, understandable, natural fear response to the event, like getting beat up, or car accident, or house fire, or rape. Anything that is a hugely terrifying event, we call that PTSD. And we just talked about all the symptoms right then, but it's a normal, natural response to one's situation, what happened to them. But it does get us going as to talking about, well, what the heck is stress? What do we mean by stress? Now, in this article, in this quote I found to be very helpful years ago when I saw it, the terms anxiety, fear, and stress are often used interchangeably. with the main differences arising in the nature of the event that elicits the emotional response and arguably the extent to which the response is appropriate or normal. Now, it's in quotes normal because it is appropriate and it is normal, but it may really interfere, like PTSD really interferes with life and success in life and happiness in life and everything else. But anyway, the terms anxiety, fear, and stress really are used all the time. But in this class, what you want to know, it is a fear response. It's primarily a fear response. That's what stress is. And then moving on then to this slide, which describes it exactly in terms of the four primary emotions. Is stress the joy response? No, obviously not. Is it the fear response? Like I just said, primarily. Is it anger? Well, in the sense that anger is usually after a big fear response. It can be after sadness and stuff like that, or just on its own, it seems like. But fear can really cause an anger response. So that's a part of stress as well. And then sadness is in the sense of like, life really sucks now after this traumatic event. And that's how I describe my stress as like this, just feeling down all the time. So that is a part of stress response. But most of the time, when we say stress, we're talking about something that is causing a fear response. The next thing I want to say is about PTSD and toxic stress. This is really important for this class. It's really important for your clients. It's really important for what you do as a clinician. It's just incredibly important. And that is that for PTSD, PTSD is a traumatic event. Toxic stress, which we're going to talk about next lecture, is about living a life in fear. One is a fearful event, and the other is living in fear all the time. But both are biologically based fear responses, both of them. But they are different psychologically and physiologically, and they have different effects on our clients. This is a critical distinction to how to know and to make diagnostically and proceed clinically. The PTSD is a traumatic event, a hugely scary event, and then toxic stress. And there is no actual diagnosis for toxic stress. There's something called generalized anxiety disorder, which is what we typically see at the end of toxic stress. But there is no separate diagnosis like there is for PTSD. But they're different psychologically and physiologically, which we'll talk about. They have different effects on our clients, and you want to know the difference between the two. The other part too is like for a lot of people, both of them happen. They're living a life of toxic stress, like there's domestic violence going on and just yelling and it's a fearful place to live in as a kid. And then you get to be 13 and you're raped or you're beat up or or traumas, like several of them can happen through a lifetime growing up or at other times of life in the midst of living in toxic stress or chronic fear. So they both, and quite often do both, go together, and you'll want to know that. So that's the end of this lecture. Hope it's been helpful to you. Again, these lectures just add to each other as we go through the course, and you understand one topic and one area to the next, but they all fit together in the end to understand your clients and how to be a great clinician for your clients. Talk to you next time.